Welcome back. We will start with lecture 5 today. This is lecture 5 of module 7. So, this is the last lecture of this module. In module 7, we are looking at the applied side of sociolinguistics, all the different modalities about language and society interaction that we have looked at so far. The application of those ideas in different domains is what we focused on in this particular module. This last lecture will be slightly different. Here we will be talking about sign language. Since sign language is also another kind of language, and sociolinguistic studies of sign language has also become quite an important domain in itself. Hence, we thought it will be a good idea to give a brief overview about that domain as well. So, this can be seen as an application, but it can also be seen as an overview of a sister domain which is connected to sociolinguistics. Sign language is just like any other natural language. It is a naturally evolved language like the vocal auditory loop language. The language that we typically use, the spoken language, is the language. It is also called the vocal language, the language dependent on the vocal auditory loop and so on. So, sign language is just a different modality, but it is also a natural language. This is used by a specific group of people. So, specifically the persons with deafness typically use sign language for their day to day communication. So, our primary difference from the vocal language is that the users of this language is a separate group who are typically deaf. Now, this is considered the mother tongue of persons with deafness and is an independent language with complex grammar involving naturally evolved visual manual signs. So, 2-3 things that are point of departure in this. One, it is a natural language just like the vocal language. Second, it is used primarily by the deaf persons, but also those people who communicate with deaf people, they use it, and this language has equally complex grammar and other kinds of structural properties just like the natural language. Now, let us see who all use this language. So, first of course, is the deaf community. They use sign language to express their ideas and views with deaf as well as hearing communities. That is important because sometimes the communication may take place between the deaf person and the hearing population. Similarly, interpreters sometimes use, they translate the oral language, the vocal language into visual manual language for deaf people. This is what we often see in the news broadcast. While the news is being read by another person, the news anchor using the vocal language, side by side we also have another person who is using sign language for those people who are deaf. This is common in news broadcast. This is also common in important speech by heads of states and others. There you will have another person. So, interpreters are there who also know and utilize sign language. Educators similarly use sign language to teach subjects and impart knowledge to deaf children. So, teachers teaching the deaf children are not always deaf themselves. So, in that case also they need to know the sign language and utilize it for teaching purposes. Similarly, parents and other professionals, parents also in order to communicate with their deaf children or other kinds of professionals. So, basically apart from the people who are themselves deaf, anyone else who needs to communicate with them also have to learn and sign the sign. So, sign language is as complex or as nuanced as a spoken language. So, it is a full-fledged, it has a full-fledged linguistic system. Not only that, factors such as the other factors like paralinguistic or extra linguistic factors like identity, community network, accessibility, all of these are also utilized just like vocal language is. They also shape how sign language is used, perceived and transmitted. Just as we have attitude and identity issues with respect to vocal language, similarly sign language also has those issues. From the perspective of language and society and social factors, these are the factors that are true for sign language as well. So, linguistic structure they have their own phonology, morphology, syntax and discourse structure. Social function similarly function socially like spoken language, marking identity, group belonging and relationships. Similarly, variation and change, this is also true for sign language. Sign language also has variations, they have regional as well as social variation, just as we have seen for spoken language they also have. So, they show regional, social and stylistic variation. Community use, used within deaf communities with their own sociolinguistic norms, attitudes and bilingual situations. So, basically both the linguistic factors as well as the extra linguistic factors, that is the social factors, are relevant for sign language just as they are for vocal languages. So, basically this cements the idea that sign language is just another language, just the modality is different. So, it is another modality dependent language, but not any way it is inferior to the spoken language. So, types of sign language, there are many types. So, we have national sign languages. So, those sign languages that are used widely in countries, sometimes beyond national borders, often emerging in deaf schools and deaf families. So, for example, American Sign Language is one of them. So, American Sign Language is widely used across US as well as outside of it. So, this is an example of national sign language. Then we have rural sign language, also referred to as shared sign language. This is used more locally in communities where both deaf and hearing members use the sign language. The domain of usage is slightly smaller compared to the national, because it is used in the local communities. Similarly, we have alternate sign language. This is used primarily by hearing speakers of mutually unintelligible spoken languages and sometimes also by deaf members of these communities, that is alternate sign language. This one example is Plains Indian Sign Language. Similarly, international use, so used globally as lingua franca in international contexts like ASL, international sign, so on and so forth. ASL is American Sign Language, similarly international sign. So, depending on many countries actually have their own sign language. So, American Sign Language, British, Indian, like that, and some of them are utilized within one country, they use one variety, but sometimes you can have also local varieties. So, that is why depending on the place of usage as well as the kind of usage, we can have this kind of 4 different types of sign languages. Social dimensions and its role. So, sociolinguistics of sign language is similar to that of spoken language, involving typically these are the domains that we study when we study sociolinguistics of sign language, studies of variation, contact, attitude and policy. These are similar to the non-verbal vocal language, but this field has slight additional unique features. For example, due to the different modality and also the relative marginalized state. These two factors are added factors, or let us say these are unique to the sign language alone. So, there are some similarities, there are some differences. Similarities are the domains that we study for sociolinguistics for vocal language are similar to that of the sign language, but in the domain of sign language we have added variables like the modality as well as the typically. Now, of course, things are better, but till some time back it was quite marginalized and as well as a result of which not very prestigious and all that. So, all of those extra factors are also part of sociolinguistic studies of sign languages. Now, these are the key themes. As you can see, these are the same themes that we have been discussing in this entire course about sociolinguistics of spoken language. So, they remain more or less the same. So, multilingualism, language contact, variation, naming practice, attitude, all of these are what we study in case of sociolinguistics of sign language as well. The typical patterns, typical things, discourse, ideology, attitude, all of that. The field reveals that sign languages exist in complex linguistic ecosystem interacting with spoken, written languages and increasingly with other sign languages. This is one interesting factor with respect to sign language research. When we talk about multilingualism among the signers, that is within the sign language community, we are not only talking about multilingualism, bilingualism of 2 different sign languages, but also signed and spoken language. So, that is also multimodal bilingualism. So, two kinds of language using two different modalities, that also is there. So, the different kinds of ecosystems exist when we talk about sign language. So, how do we define bilingualism in deaf context? Traditional definitions of bilingualism obviously assumes speaking ability in both languages. In our context, in deaf context, this needs to be reconsidered, because many deaf individuals avoid voice use since they cannot monitor volume or pitch. They might be able to use, but they typically do not use for these various reasons. Now, their bilingualism may instead involve written plus signed mode, that is why we call it bimodal. For example, written English and written English plus Auslan, or written Spanish plus Mexican sign language. So, basically depending on the sign language that they speak, and simultaneously they might use the written variety of the other spoken language. So, written English rather than spoken English, and written Spanish rather than spoken Spanish. Thus, bilingualism here means command of two linguistic systems and not necessarily two spoken codes. That is a crucial difference between bilingualism of the spoken languages versus the bilingualism in the deaf context. So, they might use two different modalities rather than speaking two different codes. Two different codes, yes, two different linguistic system, but not two spoken codes. So, multilingualism, bilingualism and language contact may have two different types. So, they are used alongside spoken and written languages and increasingly other sign languages that we have just seen. Now, in this case we have two different scenarios, together they create a rather rich multilingual environment where different modalities and linguistic systems may intersect. So, signed and spoken, signed, spoken, written contact and signed, sign contact. These are the two types of contacts, the two kinds of bilingualism, multilingualism that are relevant for our studies, signed plus spoken that we just saw, and signed and signed. So, signed with spoken and written phenomena attested in spoken language contact appeared in sign language situation, along with unique ones due to multimodal nature and sensory asymmetries. And then we have sign, which is more straightforward, two different sign languages when they interact with each other, typically in schools, through migration, in shared signing communities, via international sign, and so on and so forth. Because as you see, the sign language community also is a rich community with multiple different types of varieties, national varieties, and also they have international sign. So, groups coming in close contact, it is possible to lead to bilingualism in two different signs also, not just sign plus written, sign plus spoken, but signed and signed. Now, when signed and spoken written language contact happens, these are the types of things that happen. So, one is called the finger spelling, where manual representation of a writing system might be represented, that is called finger spelling. Then you have partial mouthing, silent articulation of spoken words while signing, both things going on simultaneously. Then code blending, also called sign speaking or code mixing, blending signed and spoken elements at the same time. The references for detailed studies for these. Then we have another type called chaining, signing a concept and then finger spelling. So, debates address the role and status of mouthings and finger spelling in sign language system. There are very interesting studies, for example, this is a recent one about the kinds of mouthings and finger spellings and all of that. So, though these are certain important research areas within this particular domain of signed and spoken versus written language contact phenomena. So, what happens when these two modalities come in contact, and the kind of results that they have, and the various nuances and the contributing factors to these, and the results of all of that. So, this is one domain within the sign language research, within the broader domain of sign language research. Now, signed and signed language contact, when two different sign languages come in contact, of course, one is school. So, countries where different deaf schools use different sign languages, minority signers typically learn the majority sign. So, this is like just as we have minority language and majority language speakers tend to learn the majority. Similarly, in the situations where two different signs come together in schools or other such kind of institutes, then the minority signers will learn the majority sign. Then migration and mobility, movement of deaf individuals across linguistic boundaries. So, if somebody moves from Mexico to US, so Mexican sign language and then they will learn American sign language, and that is one possible scenario. So, that kind of a scenario will be considered within the migration or mobility. Shared sign languages, languages in shared signing communities, like various communities in Ghana, where contact with majority sign languages can trigger endangerment as well. Again, you can see the similarity with spoken languages. So, sometimes the minority languages or smaller groups will face endangerment. So, when there are shared sign languages, and then of course, we have international sign, a contact lingua franca resulting from signers of different national sign languages encountering each other globally. So, this is the scenario at a global scale. This is at a smaller scale, at a lower local scale, and the international sign will be the situation where you have the global scale. So, all of these different contexts may result in sign and sign language contact. So, different kinds of sign languages coming in contact, and the results will be similar to what the spoken language contacts are. So, one language, the dominant one will be will create endangerment for the less dominant one, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a very interesting and important concept within sign language research, and 7 types of deaf bilinguals. So, Anne identifies 7 categories of deaf bilinguals, showing the range of linguistic repertoire found in deaf communities. So, this is a very important publication. So, linguistic framework, this is the linguistic framework XSL. X stands for sign language. So, this is like this is a variable or a placeholder. So, this can be anything, right, indicating that the category applies to any specific sign language. So, any is X here, and then sign language. It is used to show that her classifications are not limited to one particular language, such as American sign language or British sign language. Now, let us see. So, she identifies 7 types, and these are the 7 types. So, type 1, native signers of a sign language who are fluent in a spoken language, reading, writing, speaking. So, those people who are bilinguals in a spoken language as well as in a sign language. So, native signers of a sign language who are fluent in spoken language as well. Type 2, native signers of XSL who can read and write the spoken language fluently, but do not speak it. That is one difference. Then native signers of XSL who are partially literate in the spoken language, and then deaf second language XSL users who read and write a spoken language. And then type 5 is second language XSL signers who first learnt a manually coded version of the spoken language, like signed English. This is a different variety altogether. And then multilingual signers, native XSL signers who have learnt another sign language. And then last but not the least, type 7 is XSL signers L1 or L2 who can speak a spoken language. So, these are the probable varieties or the types of bilinguals in the deaf context. So, they can be they can sign in one language and speak another, or read or write another, and there are all these 7 types of possibilities. That it is a very detailed classification actually, mostly covering all the possible types. Now, within this domain there is another important idea of CODA, that stands for children of deaf adults. Now, children of deaf adults are typically native bilinguals, acquiring both a sign language and a spoken language simultaneously during childhood. Children of deaf adults, not necessarily they are also deaf. So, if they are deaf, that is a different thing, but if they are not, then they will be learning both the sign language and a spoken language at the same time. So, their bilingualism is balanced in modality, one visual manual which is the sign, and the one audio oral, that is the spoken language. However, their code mixing patterns and coda speak often show unique linguistic blending of ASL and English. This is a study on American Sign Language. So, children speaking American Sign Language whose parents are deaf. So, children of deaf adults, so they will if they are not themselves not deaf, then they will learn the spoken language as well as the sign language simultaneously. And as we all know that simultaneous bilinguals are typically balanced bilinguals, and this is what happens in this case as well. So, in the when they are balanced in modality as well as their proficiency, however, the code mixing pattern is slightly different as compared to the spoken language spoken bilinguals. Now, this is these are the main points. So, native bilingual acquire sign and spoken language simultaneously from birth. The balanced modality means the visual manual as well as oral modality, and then unique their code mixing is called coda speak. It shows distinct linguistic blending pattern. So, this is about the typical properties of children of deaf adults. Now, the types of language contact in deaf communities, I have listed them here. There are all these different possibilities that exist. So, deaf bilingual, hearing bilingual, deaf bilingual, other deaf bilingual, deaf and hearing monolingual, and so on and so forth. These are the possibilities of different types of language contact in the deaf community. Of course, I have just listed them here, but there are ample amount of research works that are available on each of them, because each type of bilingual contact or language contact for the deaf community will have a different kind of a result. That is why we need to understand all the different possibilities. Now, like any other spoken language, the sign language also has variations of types. So, phonological, morphological, syntactic and discourse variations all are there. So, variations in how a sign's components are formed. So, in this case the components will be like hand shape, location, orientation and so on, because we are talking about signing, not spoken. So, in this case these are the components. So, ASL, this is an example. So, ASL American Sign Language signs funny, black, cute can be made with the thumb either extended or closed. So, these are the variations, phonological variations. So, when we talk about hand shape, in the category of hand shape, they can have different types. So, it can be the thumb can either be extended or closed to talk about their to mean those words. Similarly, morphological changes in the internal structure of the signs, this is rare but possible. Altering number of articulators or modifying repeated movements, that is how morphological changes may happen. Syntactic variation is also possible in how signs combine into sentences. So, word order or agreement differences across regions. Then discourse differences in storytelling or conversation structure. So, regional signing traditions in narrative is where we see this difference or let us say variation in terms of the sign languages. So, just like the spoken language, sign languages will also have variations in terms of all of these properties, phonology, morphology, syntax as well as lexical variation. So, there are regional variation in lexical domain. For example, the British Sign Language and the other sign languages will have different lexical properties. Similarly, for the British Sign Language BSL, variation exists in signs for these different words between reading and york. So, two places within the British Sign Language, two different places, two different regions will have lexical variations on many words. For example, these at a global level, lexical variations can exist between all of these different varieties. So, across numerous sign languages globally, demonstrating that lexical diversity is a universal feature of sign languages, just like other spoken languages are. So, typically we talk about in case of spoken language, American English versus British English versus New Zealand English, or within New Zealand we talked about Pakeha and the Maori English. Similar kind of variations also we have here. So, different kinds of sign languages will have lexical variation as well. Regional preference is another domain that has been studied. Regional variation patterns, for example, so the variations are not random, just like any other language variety. So, Boston signers, for example, in the US, this is the US context, Boston signers favor one-handed forms, while signers in California, Kansas and Louisiana favor two-handed forms. So, within the US context, the different regions have different patterns of preferences. Also there are some constraints that have been studied. Variations are of course not random, it follows linguistic and social constraints. When you talk about constraints, these are the constraints that we are talking about. Now, understanding these constraints is crucial for comprehending the systematic nature of sign language variation. The basic point to drive home is that just as the spoken language varieties have a lot of nuances which are linguistic, which are realized linguistically, but at the behind the scene there might be social variations, various kinds of social patterns that are responsible. Similarly, sign language variations in all these different grammatical domains as well as lexical domains also have a pattern. These are some examples. So, this is one variant of chin to ear. For example, the flexibility of sign production based on grammatical context, the reversal of movement direction from the citation from shows systematic phonological variation tied to syntactic function. So, this is one. So, there are two types here. So, the chin to ear can have two different variants. Similarly, this is a compound form, this is another compound, there are different possible types there that they use. So, these are just some examples to show you how different domains, different areas depending on region as well as social variations, the sign also differs. So, regional, and now let us look at some social variation. Again the similar kind of variables that we will have here as well. So, ethnic variation, gender variation, social class variation. So, in ethnic variation, for example, differences found between African Americans and white American sign language users, there are differences, gender variation as well, social class. So, class based difference has been found in ASL with class defined using deaf community norms rather than the hearing word. So, the definition of class here slightly different, but in any case social variations are also quite common for sign language, just as it is for vocal oral languages. Then there is another form, that is the tactile sign language. Now, tactile ASL developed among deaf blind people. So, they not only deaf, but also blind. So, deaf and blind people with Usher syndrome 1 who lose sight after growing up using ASL. As a result, they have this adaptation, and this demonstrates the remarkable flexibility of sign language. These people, they grew up signing ASL, and they lost eventually they lost their sight, and as a result they developed some tactile sign language. So, this is how it kind of grew. So, facial marker adaptation, moving facial grammatical markers. So, eyebrow raises, nods to the hands, allowing tactile perception of grammatical information, because in order for you to perceive, in order for you to understand sign language, one has to see the hand movement, right. But if somebody who has lost sight will not be able to see that. So, as a result of which some special markers they created. So, eyebrow raises, nods, so which you can touch and feel, touch and understand. So, that is why this was created. Touch based cues, using touch based cues for discourse management, for example, replacing visual signs. Tactile varieties also exist for Swedish sign language and Norwegian sign language. So, many of the sign languages also have a tactile version, that is the idea. And in India, known as we also have in India, we have Indian tactile sign language, ITSL. It is an adapted form of the ISL. Just as the ASL and the Norwegian and the Swedish sign language have a tactile version, similarly Indian sign language also has a tactile variation. So, this is developed for the deaf blind community to communicate through touch, and it is promoted by organizations like Sense India and Helen Keller Institute for the deaf and blind and others. So, the idea here is that not only sign language is a natural language that is used by both within the deaf community as well as with the spoken language community, but at the same time this language shows remarkable adaptability as well, because it can adapt to a new kind of domain. So, when vision is lost, you can create some other factors, some other adaptations, some markers for marking grammatical properties of the language, and that is when you have tactile sign language. Like any other spoken varieties of language, attitudes also are an important domain of study, and attitudes and ideologies. So, attitudes and ideology in deaf community have also been studied. So, the attitudes range from pride and loyalty to stigma as well as internalized inferiority. It is not only the across groups ideology. So, how the speaking population looks at the deaf signers and other and vice versa, but also internalized by the community itself, how do they look at their own language, as just as we discuss intergroup and intragroup attitudes similarly. So, the core issue concerns whether sign languages are recognized as real complete linguistic system or viewed as inferior gestural substitutes. That has been the idea, that is the intergroup ideas are typically in these domains. Even early there were misconceptions, even somebody like Bloomfield, a leading structural linguist, claimed that gesture languages are merely developments of ordinary gesture and derivatives of spoken language. So, that was of course 1930s. So, initially spoken language community did not look upon the deaf signers as equal. It was considered some sort of a derivative form, but of course, today things have changed, but not entirely. So, there are different kinds of terms given. One of them is called oralist ideology. So, this is basically the position, academic position that legitimized oralist ideology is that the speech is inherently superior and the only valid medium of human language. So, the sign language is some way inferior to the spoken variety. That is what the oralist ideology basically talks about. So, basically superiority of the spoken variety and inferiority of the signed variety. And the contemporary perspectives of course have there are multiple views on this. So, discourses on variation and language contact are expressed in language attitudes and ideologies of signs as well, just as it is for spoken language. Ideological hierarchy between signed and spoken languages and between sign language varieties themselves relate to each other ideological and oppressive hierarchies. So, just as we have hierarchies, attitudes, identity factors within the spoken language, similarly we also have even within the within the sign language community, between sign languages one is higher, one is superior compared to the other, as well as the difference between the spoken and the sign variety. So, these are the different kinds of ideologies, which is basically akin to the ones that is there in the spoken language variety as well. But there has been some interesting work on this. There are multiple recent studies as well that we have added here, you can look up. Now, internalized attitudes within the deaf communities have also been studied. So, deaf people often show conflicting attitudes toward their own language. So, you can have pride as well as shame and as well as preference for certain kind signed English. So, all of these. So, the ambivalence, remember we talked about overt and covert prestige, something similar is also here within the community, within the deaf community. So, sometimes they have been found to be proud users of their sign language, sometimes they are not so proud. Similarly, they might have preference for one kind of sign language over another, that has been studied. On the other hand, cross national parallels also have been looked at. So, for example, one slightly older study 1985 found that many British deaf people did not even label their language as a language, calling it simply signing. In Ireland, Burns found that only 2/3 of deaf participants recognized Irish sign language as a legitimate language. So, negative self description is quite common within the deaf community itself. So, intra community under attitude also has been studied. Sometimes of course, we have some positive outcomes, but often it is more towards the negative. So, negative self description across languages is what we have seen. Discourse analysis also has been another interesting domain within the sign language groups. So, they do have a structured discourse that can be studied systematically and has been studied of course. So, scholars analyze sign language discourse using frameworks similar to those for spoken language that we have talked about before. So, we are not getting into the details. So, including speech act theory, pragmatics, interactional sociolinguistics, conversational analysis and ethnography of communication. All of these ideas we have already talked about before. The same ideas are also used to study the discourse patterns in sign languages. So, they and these are the major genres: conversation, stories, lectures, sermons, debates and so on and so forth. An additional genre arises from the interpreted discourse, which has its own norms and constraints depending on the setting. So, alongside the usual genre that we study for spoken language, it also has a similar one extra domain, which is the interpreted domain. Now, these are some of the domains that have been studied very well. So, everyday conversation, bilingual discourse, classroom discourse and the interpreted discourse, which is what we just mentioned. So, medical, legal and conference settings, this is the setting where interpreted discourse makes sense. So, these are the domains within which the discourse pattern or the critical discourse analysis within sign language have been studied. When it comes to the ideologies or the discourse pattern or the general academic ideas about sign language, we are faced with two different perspectives. One is called the medical model, the other is called the cultural-linguistic model. Now, cultural medical model basically looks at deafness as a disability, as a neurological defect. So, the moment you look at it from a medical perspective, you look at it as a problem which needs some sort of a therapy. So, therapy, surgery and assistive devices and so on and so forth. Now, this medical view aligns with what we just saw as oralist philosophy or oralist dominance or whatever ideology, basically meaning that signing is inferior and speaking is superior. So, as a result of which it discourages signing and focuses on normalizing speech. As a result of which this leads to language deprivation, as deaf children are often denied exposure to natural sign language. There is a very famous short film, very short, I think it was some 10 minutes, 20 minutes short film, exactly based on this idea of looking at sign language and looking at deaf community members and their necessity for early exposure to sign language rather than. So, this movie centers around a small child who is deaf and hence cannot follow the spoken language that is her entire family speaks, and the family's behavior can be explained with this medical model perspective, because they think that she is just not able to cope. So, they do not want to send her to a special school for the deaf, because they think by constantly speaking to her she will eventually get better. So, this as a result does not help at all, it helps nobody, it creates more problem, and the children in such cases will grow up with language deficiencies. So, this is one perspective. The other perspective is cultural linguistic model perspective. Now, here it is deafness is seen as a cultural identity defined by shared language, norm, art and community feeling. So, this is just another group of people who have a specific type of language. That is how it is seen in this other model. So, as a result this is more inclusive. Now, this emphasizes pride in deaf culture similar to ethnic or linguistic minority identities. So, as a result of which it promotes natural sign language acquisition and bilingual education approaches. So, this is more inclusive and more let us say it is more contemporary. Now, it is of course better understood today. We cannot complete this lecture without talking about Indian Sign Language. So, Indian Sign Language is now established one of the important sign languages in the world. So, the history of ISL traces back to the late 19th century when the first school for the deaf in India, the Bombay Institution for the Deaf and Mutes, was established in 1885. Early schools in Kolkata and Delhi followed an oralist approach influenced by the 1880 Milan Conference, which declared that deaf education should focus on speech rather than sign language, because they were the products of their time. So, even though they had schools and there were some efforts, but the focus was different. But eventually things changed. So, 1960s to 70s linguistic research, a lot of research went in and helped shift global perception of sign language. So, regional variations began forming, and as ISL spread, 78 Madan Vashishta, Woodward and Wilson conducted the first study of ISL, confirming it as an independent natural language. 81 the All India Federation of the Deaf published the first Indian Sign Language Dictionary, and 96 to 2001 further linguistic research by Ulrike Zishan and others. The dictionary is produced by Ramakrishna Mission Vidyalaya depend the understanding of ISL's infrastructure in the Indian context. So, even though the focus on Indian Sign Language started early in the initial stages, the focus was on giving them speech rather than encouraging sign language, but eventually in independent India 1960s onwards steady changes, steady development has taken place through research and through various kinds of approaches by different kinds of institutions which contributed heavily. One of them was of course Ramakrishna Mission, as we saw in the previous slide also. So, Ramakrishna Mission has the faculty of disability management and special education of Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda University has been involved in various activities supporting ISL. Their contribution has been immense, and they have developed the initially they in the 2001 onward they have been contributing immensely. So, 2001 they had created a dictionary with 1600 words, then this followed by technical dictionary, banking terminology, physics terminology, all of these were developed by them. 2005 offering diploma in Indian Sign Language interpretation, then they also have awareness programs, digital initiative, research, collaboration and so on and so forth. So, a lot of work has been carried out by the Ramakrishna Mission in not only creating dictionaries and creating different kinds of dictionaries like normal usual dictionary to technical dictionary, digital domains and so on and so forth, but research as well, and they also have various programs run by the institute. So, they have educational services like speech therapy, special integrated mainstream schools along with their higher secondary education. They also have BA, BCom and BSc degrees accessible to deaf learners, postgraduate degrees, teacher education, vocational training and so on and so forth. Primarily the baseline is that Indian Sign Language not only in terms of corpus planning, but also in terms of making them independent, self-reliant through education. These are the domains where Ramakrishna Mission has worked quite heavily. So, this is about Indian Sign Language. We can wrap up this segment by saying that sign language sociolinguistics is a vibrant area of research. Now, that includes all the nuances of spoken language and more, because the modality is different, challenges are different and often they start from a disadvantaged position in some cases. Of course, things are much better now, but so because of all of these extra factors, this becomes a challenging domain of research and quite a vibrant one. So, this is where we complete this lecture and also this module. So, module 7 ends here. Thank you.